Hello and welcome to week 6 in developmental psych. And this is a big chapter. It's a transition chapter in terms of understanding the full scope of lifespan development. This is lots of socio-cultural things come in as expectations for adulthood begin to mix with the expectations for childhood. And we end up with this middle ground that we talk about as adolescence. Now, right at the beginning of the chapter, I talk about the fact that long term, we've always sort of experienced and studied adolescence as a period of storm and stress as people were trying to manage that transition from childhood expectations into adult expectations. That, in fact, does not play out when we actually look at the research. Yes, definitively, there is a conflict that comes into in terms of families and whatnot, expectations and whatnot. But the vast majority of adolescents travel through this period of time with little to no problem. That doesn't mean that there aren't problems, but in reality, it's not that big of a deal as we like to think about it. Just like many other things, when things start to go wrong, we tend to expand them in our minds. But the research really says that despite the fact that there are real conflicts and whatnot, most people transition through this very readily. But there's some cool stuff going on. Developmentally, there's cool. Some of my favorite theories of all time start to get a part of the human development, and the research that I'm doing on puzzle pieces really sort of takes off right at this particular time. Okay, so we have a couple discussions, a quiz, and an assignment, and the quests to do this week. Now, the first discussion looks at the biology of the connection between the frontal cortex and the mammalian emotional part of the brain, and that connection isn't quite made. And because of brain science, because of brain imaging and us understanding the development of the brain, this is actually impacting our view of adolescents who commit crimes. Because for someone to commit a crime and to be charged for that crime, they not only need to be guilty, they not only to have done it, they have to be culpable. That's a legal term for they have to understand that what they're doing is a violation of the law, and they do it anyway. So they have to demonstrate, or the prosecution has to demonstrate, that the individual knew what they were doing, knew it was wrong, and did it anyway, and therefore they're guilty and culpable, responsible for the consequences of their actions. Brain science is starting to look at this, this connection between the amygdala that wants to do whatever it wants. It's kind of like the id of the biology of our brain is not connected to the frontal cortex, where decision-making, weighing pros and cons is there. And there's a feasible argument that adolescents who are engaged in some of these behaviors might be guilty, but they may not be culpable because they don't understand the consequences. That's not universal. It's not you're not culpable until this age. There are certain people below age 18 that are culpable, and there are people above 18 that are not culpable. And, this is a thing in process. And certainly there's lots of controversy and different opinions about that. So we want to have a little discussion about that. Next, we're going to go into, in discussion B, we're going to talk about a component of the theories of David Elkind. Now, David Elkind is not Erickson. These are two different people. David Elkind is a contemporary psychologist. He's actually the consulting psychologist for WebMD. That's his full-time gig, I think. And he talks about the unique nature of the cognitive processes that are going on in adolescence, grouped under an umbrella of adolescent egocentrism, and then other components to that. So I want you to read about adolescent egocentrism, the different components of adolescent egocentrism. Again, don't get that confused with Erikson, and discuss maybe of adolescence, your memories as an adolescent, to when you were kind of a little egocentric. Maybe you were, a little bit of the personal fable going on. Nobody understands where I'm coming from. The sense that you're always on stage, so every casual glance, there's lots of interpretation that goes on when somebody gives you a casual glance. Oh, they must be talking about me. Those kinds of qualities that distinguish sort of that transition period between true cognitive egocentrism, which occurs in childhood, and then perspective taking that we see in adulthood. And it's sort of this transition of awareness of other people, almost like theory of mind, but awareness of those individuals, perspective of us, or we project those into others. Lots of interesting things associated with that. Lots of things about peer pressure evolve from that. Lots of things about kids going along with other things and being worried about what they're dressed like and whether they have the right shoes of the season or something like that. All of that stuff really wraps itself into this concept of Elkind's egocentrism, or adolescent egocentrism. In the quiz, we're kind of combining those. I'm asking you about the prefrontal cortex development and our understanding of not crime and culpability, but of perspective taking. Again, we're looking at this. Does all this need to come together? The experiences in the world, the egocentrism, then finally they click and the frontal cortex connects to that emotional center in the brain. And then finally someone's able to say, wow, I'm not the center of the universe. They actually transition into a much more adult perspective. Mind you, not everybody achieves that. And finally, we're left with the assignment. And the assignment actually introduces you to one of, it's a core aspect of my work in puzzle pieces that you'll be experiencing later. But James Marcia's work on identity status builds on the notion of Erikson's theory of adolescence being a time of identity development. Now, Marcia's theory applies across the entire lifespan. It applies throughout aspects of our lives, and it's just a very, very rich source of understanding about how we progress. What it specifically does, it says if we take a snapshot of somebody and we look at each aspect, I'll use the analogy of a jigsaw puzzle, which is what I use in my theory. Our identity is made up of a bunch of different pieces. I have a gender identity, I have a work identity, I have a relationship identity, I have a community identity, all of those things. And each one of those pieces builds the full picture of who I am as a person who has an identity. Marcia's theory says that each one of those pieces, some are in development, some are back burner, some you're actively working on, some you've decided on a long time ago, that each one of those pieces could be at a particular time. If you took a snapshot of your life, you might have some of your pieces which are foreclosed, always been there, never questioned what they were. There might be some that are in moratorium, an aspect of your identity that you're continued actively working on. There could be diffused, which means it's something I'm not worried about right. It hasn't come on my plate yet, like retirement planning or where I'm going to live when I'm retired. Not on my mind right now. It is an aspect of my identity, but it's in the future. And then finally, what Marcia talked about, the goal of this is to have an achieved identity. An achieved identity is only achieved when somebody has actually examined the options. Now, the two characteristics that he talks about in terms of examining the options and deciding is actually crisis and commitment. Not the same use of the word crisis that we usually refer to when we're thinking about someone who, might need to be restrained. It's not that. It's more like the true definition of, let's say, the identity crisis that we often associate with middle age, midlife crisis. That term is simply, I'm examining where I am right now, and this is where I am in terms of having made decisions or committed to something. So we have that graphic that I present to you in the course book. However, even though you can take a snapshot and you can get parts of your identity in all kinds of different statuses, what I'm asking you to do in this assignment is different. I'm actually asking you to look at one aspect of your identity. Let's call it your choosing the college you're going to. Now, no one can do this one. You can't do anything. None of you can do this one. Choosing the college. So, and you look, I mean, obviously you chose KVCC. There was a decision process going in there. What I want you to give me is a timeline that shows how you moved that piece of your identity from diffused at some point in your life, you weren't even thinking about it, through the process of moratorium, we'll talk about diffusion in a second, and then finally into achieved status, you are now a KVCC student. But look at some aspect of your life. Now, for aspects of our life like gender, this is a really interesting terminology to use to talk about the process of individuals examining their gender identity. Certainly we're born, and even within the language they're talking about it, an assigned sex at birth is a form of foreclosed identity, meaning I was born with that. That's what people gave me before I had any sort of decision about it and blah, blah, blah. And for many people, the majority of people, they're fine. It aligns with everything they experience, aligns with internal feelings. And even though that identity is foreclosed and the person has never gone through a process of necessarily looking at the options, they have an achieved identity of their gender identity, an achieved status. However, if someone is born with an assigned gender and they begin to have experiences that the outside world seems to be mismatched with the label and what they feel, that individual may enter into a period of moratorium, searching for the options. Now, that individual searching for the options, of course, in today's world, there's lots of options, lots of risks and benefits for going down that path. That's just the reality of our society in its infancy, accepting different kinds of identity that there are. And then the individual may come to a place where they have settled upon a label for they found a comfortable place, and we would call that achieved identity. So those kinds of aspects of our identity that are more fluid, that we make active decisions on, are the ones that I would like you to look at in this perspective. But I want you to tell me not just where you are today, but the path you have taken. And I want you to pick one that is achieved. If you want to share, in addition to that, if you simply want to share as a process with me aspects of your identity that are maybe still in moratorium because of their foreclosed status, sort of like maybe career-wise. I had a student once who was going to KVCC, came from a family of attorneys. She was going into mental health. She was, as much as she had decided to come to school, she was really deciding whether or not she was going to go to the foreclosed identity of her career of becoming an attorney just like everybody else in her family. She was sort of the black sheep of the family. And it was a current sort of issue with that individual. And she used that for this assignment, and it was very informative about the process of her decision making to shape that individual part of her identity, much to the chagrin of her family, which felt that this was a waste of time and you need to be a lawyer just like everybody else. And it's made for some very interesting in-class conversations as well. So that's the assignment, to look at one aspect of your identity and trace its path through as many of those statuses as you can. So it's not four different parts of your identity. That's easy. It's looking at one aspect of your achieved identity and marking the time when you felt it was diffused, whether or not it was foreclosed or not, when you went through the what happened when you were going through the period of moratorium about that particular aspect of your identity, and where is it today as an achieved aspect of your identity. So, of course, you have to read about these a lot, digest them, look this stuff up so you get other perspectives aside from the one in my course book and the textbook. Kind of really try to get your hand around this particular theory, because it's going to come up again when we talk about puzzle pieces. Very, very important theory in my theory. So that's the week. Last point, an announcement. I am going to be away for all of this week. You are on your own. I'm taking a vacation, going to Savannah, Georgia. I'm leaving in mere hours from now. So I will be relatively out of touch. You are fully competent enough to run this class on your own. I will not be completely out of touch. I am going to set up probably an auto reply on my email. I'm still going to have my phone. I'll probably start in the morning, check if there's any disasters going on. So I'm not completely out of the picture. But do this one on your own. You're not going to see me engaged in any of the discussions. I think you're all set. I mean, I've been actually pulling back from the discussions because you guys are all rock stars. And so have a great week. I know I'm going to have a great week. I hope you do too. And I will see you sometime probably Monday or Tuesday next week. I'm flying back in on Monday, and I'll get the next set of videos out to start the week. It'll be late, obviously, but then you folks have been good to carry on into the next material. It's right there in the course timeline. So have a great week. Have a good time with these. These are some of my favorite assignments to grade. Introducing people to this marvelous work of a Canadian psychologist, James Marcia, and one of my national. I'm Canadian too, so I like that. All right, so have a great week, and I will see you sometime next week. Take care.